The air in the admissions department of St. Jude's General Hospital was a sterile cocktail of antiseptic, floor wax, and quiet, suffocating desperation. It was a smell Sarah Jenkins knew well, but tonight it felt like it was actively trying to choke her. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sickly, unforgiving glare on the linoleum floors and the weary faces that passed through this late-night purgatory. Her hand trembled, not from cold, but from the sheer, crushing weight of the decision before her. She stared down at her left ring finger, at the simple, elegant gold band that had become as much a part of her as a knuckle or a nail. It was a circle of warm history against her cold skin, its intricate filigree whispering stories of a love that had weathered wars and depressions. Now she was twisting it, the metal catching on her skin as if resisting what she was about to do. Across the counter, Brenda, the night shift admissions clerk, was a monument to bureaucratic indifference. Her face, framed by severe steel-gray hair, was impassive. Her voice was flat, polished, smooth, by 1,000 identical refusals. "Ma'am, as I have explained," Brenda said, her gaze flicking impatiently from Sarah to the computer screen, "hospital policy is unequivocal. Without verified insurance or a prepayment of $25,000 for the neurointerventionalist and the surgical suite, we cannot proceed with an emergency thrombectomy. The patient will be kept stable and transferred to a county facility in the morning." "In the morning?" The words came out as a choked sob from a young woman named Maria, who stood beside Sarah, her face pale and streaked with tears. She was a stranger to the man in ER Bay 4, just as Sarah was. She had found him collapsed on the sidewalk, a crumpled heap of worn flannel and denim. The doctor said morning would be too late. He said every single minute counts. David, the Good Samaritan who had helped Maria call 911 and had waited for hours, ran a hand through his thinning hair. "There has to be something you can do. This is a hospital, for God's sake." Brenda's expression didn't flicker. To her, this wasn't a matter of life and death. It was a matter of accounts receivable. She pushed her glasses up her nose with a finger that seemed to judge them all for their emotional, unprofitable outburst. Sarah looked from Brenda's cold, dismissive eyes to Maria's terrified ones. She thought of the man lying on the gurney, a John Doe, with no name, no family, no one in the world to claim him. His face was etched with the lines of a hard life, his hands calloused and still. But he was breathing. His heart was beating. He was a life, hanging by the thinnest of threads. And that thread was about to be cut by a line item on a budget sheet. In that moment, something inside Sarah solidified, turning from frantic empathy into a core of unshakable resolve. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory, a whisper from a sunnier, kinder time. "Love and integrity are the only things you truly own." Her hand stopped trembling. With a final, decisive twist, she pulled the gold band from her finger. The skin beneath was pale, indented, a ghost of the ring's presence. She took a deep breath, the sterile air filling her lungs, and placed the small, heavy circle of gold on the worn Formica countertop. It made a soft, definitive clink. "This is my grandmother's wedding ring," Sarah said, her voice quiet but firm, cutting through the hum of the lights. "It was appraised for our homeowner's insurance last year. It's worth more than what you're asking. Take it as collateral. Just save his life." The world seemed to fall silent. Maria gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. David stared, speechless. For the first time all night, Brenda's mask of indifference cracked. She stared at the ring, a small pool of warm gold under the cold lights, then looked up at Sarah, her eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and something that looked unnervingly like disdain. "This is highly irregular, Nurse Jenkins," Brenda finally said, her voice tight. "You are putting this hospital in a very, very difficult position." The rage, hot and sharp, began as a tiny spark in Sarah's chest. The system's first reaction to an act of pure, selfless compassion was not gratitude, but annoyance. A difficult position. As if a human life wasn't. 2 hours earlier, the world had still made sense. The ER had been its usual state of controlled chaos, a symphony of beeping monitors, rolling gurneys, and voices pitched at every level of human emotion. And Sarah had been its conductor, moving with a grace and competence that belied her 26 years. She'd charmed a frightened 6-year-old into getting stitches by declaring him a superhero in training and bestowing upon him a coveted dinosaur sticker. She'd spent 10 minutes patiently explaining medication side effects to an elderly man's anxious wife, holding her hand until her breathing evened out. She was good at her job because she saw the person, not the ailment, the human, not the chart number. "You're a machine, Jenkins," her work best friend, Chloe, had said with an admiring grin as they restocked a supply cart. "Don't you ever get tired of being so nice?" Sarah had just smiled. "It's easier than being mean." Then the paramedics had burst through the ambulance bay doors, their shouts slicing through the din. Unresponsive male, late 60s. Found down on the sidewalk, no ID, no witnesses to the event. GCS of 5. On the gurney was the man, John Doe. Sarah had been the primary nurse assigned to his bay, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she took his vitals, established an IV line, and recorded the paramedics' report. Dr. Evans, a brilliant, perpetually exhausted ER physician, had taken one look at the man's drooping face and the initial scan results. His expression was grim. Massive ischemic stroke. Major blockage in the middle cerebral artery. He needs a mechanical thrombectomy, and he needs it 5 minutes ago. He ran a hand over his face. "If we don't get that clot out, he'll either die before sunrise or be left with catastrophic permanent brain damage. He'll be a ghost in a shell." "Doctor," Evans had then slammed his pen down on the counter, the frustration boiling over. "I can't authorize the procedure. Administration won't approve a specialist or the suite without payment or insurance. My hands are tied. It's insane. We're supposed to be saving lives, not protecting profit margins." That line had echoed in Sarah's head as she'd stood at the admissions counter, the weight of a man's future resting on her shoulders. The system was broken. So she had done the only thing she could think of. She had broken the rules. The small apartment Sarah shared with her husband Mark was their sanctuary from the world's sharp edges. It wasn't Mucha fourth-floor walk-up with pipes that groaned and a view of a brick wall, but it was theirs. Every object told the story of their life together, a love story built on a shoestring budget. Mark's architecture textbooks were piled high on a desk he'd built himself. The refrigerator door was a collage of their LIFA goofy photo booth strip from their wedding, a postcard from a weekend trip to the coast, and, tucked under a magnet shaped like a chili pepper, a small, menacing stack of bills, student loans, car payment, rent. They were a team. Mark spent his days hauling drywall and lumber on construction sites, his evenings hunched over blueprints and structural engineering problems for night school. Sarah spent her days healing people. They were building a future, one grueling, exhausting day at a time. "Hey, I'm thinking if we eat ramen for 3 more nights this week, we can actually afford to see that new sci-fi movie on Sunday instead of waiting for it to stream," Mark had joked just last night, wrapping his strong arms around her from behind as she stood at the sink. Sarah had laughed, leaning back against his sturdy chest. "Deal. But I get to pick the flavor. No more spicy shrimp." She had been washing dishes, her hands submerged in warm, soapy water. The gold of her wedding ring had caught the light, and she'd paused to admire it. It was her most prized possession, the one object in their life that felt truly valuable. Mark had noticed her gaze and gently taken her wet hand, lifting it to kiss her ring finger. The memory it always sparked was immediate and vivid. A sun-drenched hospital room, the scent of lavender and antiseptic mingling in the air. Her grandmother, frail and bird-like against the starched white pillows, her voice a reedy whisper. She had pressed the ring into Sarah's palm, the gold still warm from her own finger. "This ring saw your grandfather and me through a war, and the Great Depression," her grandmother had said, her eyes, though faded, full of fierce love. "It's not made of gold, it's made of promises kept. When things get hard, Sarah girl, you look at this and you remember that love and integrity are the only things you truly own. They can't be bought, and they can't be taken away unless you let them. Promise me you'll keep it safe." "I promise, Grandma," a younger Sarah had whispered, tears tracing paths down her cheeks. Now, hours after her confrontation with Brenda, Sarah walked into her apartment like a ghost. The exhaustion was bone deep, but it was overshadowed by a profound sense of loss. She sank onto their beat-up but beloved sofa, the cushions sighing under her weight. The empty space on her finger felt cold, a tiny, screaming void. Mark came home an hour later, smelling of sawdust and sweat. He took one look at her face and his own tired expression was replaced with immediate concern. He knelt before her, taking her hands in his. "Sarah, what's wrong? What happened?" She told him everything. The John Doe, the stroke, Dr. Evans's frustration, Brenda's cold refusal, and the final, desperate act. She couldn't look him in the eye. staring instead at the pale, naked skin where the ring used to be. Mark was silent for a long, heavy moment. She could feel the storm of emotions rolling through him. Shock, certainly. Fear, absolutely. He was the practical one, the one who balanced their checkbook down to the penny. But when he finally spoke, his voice was thick with an emotion that made her heart ache. "You saved a man's life, Sarah," he said, his calloused thumbs gently stroking the backs of her hands. "A life. We have student debt and a crappy car and we eat too much ramen. That man had nothing. You did the right thing. You did the only thing someone like you could do." He finally pulled her into a fierce hug, burying his face in her hair. She clung to him, the tears she'd been holding back finally breaking free. After a moment, he pulled back, his expression now shadowed with the practical reality of her decision. "But," he said softly, his voice laced with the fear she was also feeling, "what are we going to do? That ring it was our only real asset. Your grandmother's ring." It wasn't an accusation. It was a question hanging in the air of their small apartment, a question with no easy answer. They held each other, a united front against a future that had just become terrifyingly uncertain. The summons came the next morning via a sterile corporate email. "Please report to the office of Hospital Administrator Gary Davies at 9:00 a.m. sharp." Sarah stood before the imposing mahogany door, smoothing down her scrubs for the 10th time. A small, naive part of her hoped for understanding, perhaps even quiet commendation for going above and beyond. That hope died the moment she stepped inside. Gary Davies' office was a temple to the bottom line. The walls were adorned not with art, but with framed charts showcasing upward trending profit margins. The vast window behind his desk offered a panoramic view of the city, a view he kept his back to, as if the messy lives of the people below were a distraction. Davies himself was a man in his 50s, with a soft physique, a hard face, and the placid, unblinking eyes of a predator. "Nurse Jenkins, please, sit," he said, gesturing to a small, uncomfortable chair positioned strategically lower than his own. Sarah sat. He let the silence stretch, a tactic designed to make her squirm. It worked. "Do you have any idea what you have done?" he finally began, his voice dangerously calm. It was the calm of a bomb before it detonates. He didn't mention the patient. He didn't mention the successful surgery. He talked about liability. "You accepted personal property as collateral for a medical procedure," he stated, steepling his fingers. "An item of indeterminate and unverified value. You exposed this hospital to immense financial and legal liability. What if the ring was a fake? What if it was stolen? What if you decided to claim it was worth 10 times what it is?" He went on, his voice gaining a sharp, accusatory edge. "Furthermore, you willfully circumvented established financial protocols. These rules exist for a reason, nurse. They exist to ensure the fiscal health and smooth operation of this institution. By ignoring them, you have set a dangerous precedent. What if every nurse decided to start bartering for services?" His final point landed like a slap. "Most troublingly, you allowed your emotions to dictate hospital procedure. Your job, Nurse Jenkins, is to be a nurse. You are paid to provide medical care. You are not paid to be a charity, a social worker, or a financial martyr. Your actions were unprofessional." Sarah sat there, stunned into silence. He had taken an act of compassion and twisted it into a crime sheet of corporate malfeasance. "Consider this your one and only warning," Davies concluded, his eyes like chips of ice. "You are on official probation, effective immediately. One more step out of line, one more deviation from protocol, and your contract with St. Jude's will be terminated. The ring," he added as an afterthought, "has been moved from admissions to the hospital vault for professional appraisal and safekeeping. You may consider it forfeit until this matter is fully resolved." She left his office in a daze, her cheeks burning with humiliation. The spark of rage from the night before was now a steady, sickening fire in her gut. The fire was fanned into a blaze the moment she stepped onto the ER floor for her shift. Brenda, the admissions clerk, who was also, to Sarah's misfortune, the head nurse for the day shift, was waiting. She had clearly been briefed by Davies and now wore an air of smug vindication. The campaign of torment began immediately. It wasn't overt enough to file a complaint about. It was a death by 1,000 paper cuts. "Some of us understand that rules are what separate a hospital from chaos," Brenda announced loudly at the nurse's station, her eyes fixed pointedly on Sarah. "Professional boundaries are a sign of a professional nurse." Her assignments for Sarah were a litany of the worst jobs in the ER, cleaning up a gory trauma bay after a failed resuscitation, dealing with a belligerent drunk who needed to be sedated, and 3 straight hours of mind-numbing inventory paperwork in a stuffy closet. When Chloe tried to trade her a simple IV drip for the inventory duty, Brenda had intercepted them. "Nurse Miller, I need you on the 3rd floor. And Nurse Jenkins has her assigned tasks. We all need to pull our own weight." She'd given Chloe a look that said, "Stay away from her if you know what's good for you." The other nurses took their cue. Some offered Sarah fleeting, sympathetic glances before quickly looking away. Others, eager to stay in Brenda's good graces, treated her with a new chilly distance. She was an outcast, a pariah, isolated in the very place she had once felt she belonged. Meanwhile, in the quiet of the ICU, the man formerly known as John Doe was awake. His name, the chart now said, was Arthur Pendleton. He couldn't speak much yet, the stroke having temporarily stolen his words, but he could see and he could hear, and he was a keen observer. He saw the way Nurse Jenkins, the one with the kind eyes and the gentle hands, always seemed to get the worst duties. He saw the head nurse watch her with a hawk-like intensity, her lips curled in a perpetual sneer. He heard the whispers at the nurse's station, snippets of conversations about the ring and probation. He saw Sarah check on him, her smile for him genuine and warm, but he also saw the deep weariness in her eyes the moment she turned away. He remained silent, but he was gathering data, filing away every slight, every injustice, with a mind that was as sharp as the diamonds upon which he had built an empire. The situation escalated 2 days later. A low-level tech in radiology, a kid who thought Sarah was a hero, had anonymously leaked the story to a local gossip blogger. The story, however, was like a game of telephone, each retelling twisting it further from the truth. By the time it went viral, the headline was a salacious piece of clickbait. St. Jude's Hospital forces desperate nurse to pay for patient's care with precious wedding ring. The hospital's reaction was swift and brutal. Instead of defending the employee who had saved a life, they moved to protect their brand. Mr. Davies, his face a mask of feigned concern, held a press conference. "St. Jude's has robust and generous financial aid programs for those in need," he lied smoothly to the cameras. The recent incident, while involving a perhaps well-intentioned employee, was a serious and flagrant breach of hospital protocol. Her actions are not representative of our policies or values. A full internal investigation is already underway to determine the appropriate disciplinary action. The appropriate disciplinary action, it turned out, was another summons to Davies' office. This time he didn't bother with the pretense of calm. His face was blotchy with rage. "A media firestorm!" he hissed, throwing a printout of the blog post onto his desk. "You have dragged the name of this hospital through the mud. You are a liability, Nurse Jenkins." "I didn't talk to anyone," Sarah protested, her voice shaking. "I didn't want this." "It doesn't matter," Davies snapped. "You created the situation. Effective immediately, you are on indefinite, unpaid administrative leave pending the conclusion of our investigation." It was a coward's way of firing her. He'd made her radioactive, and now he was casting her out. The news reached her in-laws before Sarah even had a chance to process it. Mark's mother, Carol, called that evening. Her voice was a razor blade over the phone line. "I just saw an article online, Sarah. Tell me it's not true," Carol began, the false calm in her voice more terrifying than shouting. "Some of it is, but it's twisted," Sarah started to explain. Carol cut her off. "You gave away your grandmother's wedding ring, the one Mark's grandmother gave you, for some homeless person? And now you've lost your job? What in God's name were you thinking? You are dragging my son down with your irresponsible, sentimental nonsense. He works himself to the bone, and you're throwing away your future for a complete stranger." The words were a brutal, personal assault, striking at all her deepest insecurities. Mark, hearing the tone of the conversation, grabbed the phone. "Mom, stop it. That's enough." He argued fiercely with his mother, but Sarah could still hear the shrill accusations through the receiver. She curled up on the sofa, wrapping her arms around herself, feeling utterly and completely alone. The final blow came the next evening, a sharp, authoritative knock on the door. When Mark opened it, a uniformed police officer stood in the hallway. "Evening. I'm Officer Miller," he said, his eyes scanning the small apartment with a practiced, weary cynicism. "I'm here to speak with a Sarah Jenkins." The hospital, in its desperate attempt to frame Sarah as a rogue agent, had filed an official report about the irregular handling of valuable assets, a thinly veiled suggestion of impropriety. Officer Miller's questioning took place at their small kitchen table. He was not overtly hostile, but his tone was thick with condescension and disbelief. "So let me get this straight, ma'am," he said, clicking his pen. "You, a registered nursemaking," he glanced at a form. "This salary gave a family heirloom you claim is worth over $25,000 to a total stranger you'd known for less than 2 hours. No one forced you? No one made any threats?" "No," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. "I wanted to save his life." Officer Miller sighed, a long, theatrical exhalation of disbelief. "Ma'am, with all due respect, you have to admit that this story sounds unlikely. It has all the hallmarks of a sophisticated insurance scam. Or perhaps you were coerced in a way you're afraid to admit. We just need to get your official statement for the record." He treated her not as a hero, but as a suspect. Or worse, a fool. He, like everyone else, looked at her act of profound sacrifice and saw only a problem, a deviation from the norm, a lie. The systems she had dedicated her life to upholding healthcare, family, and now the law had all turned on her, chewed her up, and spat her out. This was rock bottom. The days that followed blurred into a gray haze of despair. The apartment, once their sanctuary, felt like a prison. Sarah sat on the couch, the curtains drawn, the silence broken only by the hum of the refrigerator. She was suspended, broke, shamed by her family, and now the subject of a police investigation. She was a ghost in her own life. She looked at Mark as he sat beside her, his face etched with worry. The weight of what she had done, of the chaos she had unleashed upon them, felt like a physical stone in her chest. "Did I ruin us, Mark?" she whispered into the gloom, the words tasting like ash. "Was my grandmother's promise about love, or was it just about being a fool? Maybe they're all right. Maybe I was just stupid." Her voice broke on the last word. It was the first time she had truly allowed the doubt to surface, and it was agonizing. Mark turned, his expression fierce. He knelt on the floor in front of her, taking her hands in his. His grip was firm, an anchor in the storm. "Hey, look at me," he said, his voice low and intense. "That man is alive today because of you. He is alive and he has a future, because of what you did in that hospital. That is the only fact that matters. I would rather be broke and eating ramen for the rest of my life with the woman who did that, than be rich and comfortable with someone who would have turned their back and let him die. That is who you are, Sarah, and that is the woman I fell in love with. We will not let them break you. I will not let them break you." His words were a shield, a defiant roar against the cynical world that was trying to crush her spirit. Tears streamed down her face, but for the first time in days, they were tears of gratitude, not despair. He held her, and in the small, dark apartment, their love felt like the only sane thing left. It was 2 days later that the envelope arrived. It wasn't from the hospital or the police. It was a thick, cream-colored stationery delivered by a private courier. Inside, Sarah found a single, heavy business card. She read the words, then read them again, her mind struggling to connect them to reality. Arthur Pendleton, CEO, Pendleton Global Diamonds. At the bottom, a handwritten note in a surprisingly steady script. "Ms. Jenkins, I would like to thank you personally. Please call my assistant to arrange a meeting. It is a matter of great importance." Sarah and Mark stared at the card, then at each other. Mark scrambled for his laptop, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He typed the name into a search engine. The screen filled with images of one of the world's most reclusive and powerful billionaires. There were photos of him at galas years ago, shaking hands with presidents, his name attached to philanthropic foundations and colossal business deals. And then, there was a more recent, candid shot, a paparazzi photo of him on a walk, dressed in simple, unassuming clothes. It was him. The faded flannel shirt, the worn boots, the face etched with lines of thought and age, John Doe. The man whose life she had saved. It was Arthur Pendleton. The shock was a physical jolt, a sudden, blinding flash of light in their dark world. The headquarters of Pendleton Global Diamonds was not a building, it was a statement. A gleaming shard of glass and steel that pierced the city's skyline, it radiated a quiet, terrifying power. Dressed in their best and only formal clothes, a simple black dress for Sarah, a slightly too tight suit for Mark, they felt like mice entering a lion's den. They were escorted by a silent assistant to the top floor. The elevator doors opened directly into a vast boardroom that seemed to float above the city. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a godlike, panoramic view. In the center of the room sat a single, massive table cut from a single piece of dark oak, polished to a mirror shine. At the far end of the table, silhouetted against the sky, sat Arthur Pendleton. He was dressed in an impeccably tailored navy suit, his silver hair neatly combed. The frail, anonymous patient was gone. In his place sat a titan of industry, his eyes, the same sharp, observant eyes from the ICU, radiating an intensity that was startling. Beside him stood a poised woman in a business suit, Ms. Bravern. Vance, his executive assistant. Ms. Jenkins, Mr. Jenkins, Arthur said, his voice calm and resonant, filling the cavernous room. Thank you for coming. Please have a seat. They sat, their hands clasped tightly together on the table. A few minutes later, the elevator doors chimed again. Mr. Gary Davies and head nurse Brenda were escorted in. They both wore expressions of smug satisfaction. Clearly, they believed they'd been summoned to be praised for their handling of a difficult situation, probably to finalize a large donation from the grateful billionaire. Davies shot Sarah a condescending smirk, a look that said, "See? The adults are in charge now." Brenda simply sniffed, refusing to even acknowledge Sarah's presence. They took seats opposite Sarah and Mark. The trap was now set. The elevator chimed one last time. The final guests arrived, two serious-looking individuals, a man and a woman, who introduced themselves as senior reporters from the city's most respected newspaper. And behind them, a stern, silver-haired man whom Davies and Brenda recognized with a jolt of panic, Mr. Harrison, the chairman of the board for St. Jude's Hospital. The smugness evaporated from Davies' face, replaced by a pasty confusion. Brenda's triumphant posture deflated, and a flicker of raw fear entered her eyes. They were no longer here for a commendation. They were here for a reckoning. Arthur let the silence hang for a moment, allowing the tension to build to an unbearable pitch. Then, he began to speak. "Thank you all for joining me," he started, his gaze sweeping across the table. "I've called this meeting to clear up a few misunderstandings surrounding my recent stay at St. Jude's." He told the story from the beginning. His habit of taking anonymous walks through the city, a practice he maintained to stay grounded and remember what the world looks like outside of rooms like this. He described the sudden, terrifying onset of the stroke, the feeling of the world dissolving into darkness. "I woke up in your ICU," he said, his eyes locking onto Davies. "And for several days I was unable to speak. But I could see, and I could listen." His voice was still calm, but it had taken on a core of steel. "I heard the whispers. I saw the way one of your nurses, a young woman who, by all accounts, was solely responsible for my being alive, was treated. I saw her isolated, humiliated, and punished. Punished for an act of selfless compassion." He turned his full attention to Davies, who was now visibly sweating. "Mr. Davies, I have read the public statement your office released. You spoke of liability, of protocol, of brand management. You took an act of profound human decency, and you painted it as a procedural error. You lead an institution of healing, yet your first instinct was to punish a healer to protect your balance sheet." Arthur paused, letting the indictment sink in. "Therefore, I am prepared to make a donation of $50 million to St. Jude's Hospital." Davies' eyes widened, a flicker of desperate hope in them. The chairman, Mr. Harrison, leaned forward. "On two conditions," Arthur continued, his voice dropping slightly. "First, your immediate, unconditional, and permanent resignation from your post." The chairman of the board did not hesitate. He looked at Davies with eyes of cold, hard stone. Davies' career was over. He seemed to shrink in his chair, his face collapsing. Arthur then shifted his gaze to Brenda, who flinched as if struck. "Head nurse Brenda," he said, his voice laced with contempt. "I was your patient. I saw your cruelty up close. I saw how you wielded your tiny bit of authority not to lead or inspire, but to intimidate and bully a colleague who represents the very best of your profession. A leader builds a team. You created a toxic environment of fear." He turned to the chairman. "My donation is also contingent on a full, board-level review of Nurse Brenda's conduct and her immediate, permanent reassignment to a non-supervisory role where she can no longer harm the morale of her colleagues." Brenda turned a shade of pale white, her mouth opening and closing silently, like a fish out of water. "My second condition for the donation," Arthur announced to the room, "is the establishment of the Sarah Jenkins Promise Fund. It will be an endowment, to be used in perpetuity, to cover the full cost of life-saving emergency procedures for any patient who is uninsured, underinsured, or simply cannot pay. It will be administered by a new, independent board, and I would like to offer its inaugural directorship, with a salary commensurate with its profound importance, to Miss Sarah Jenkins. Sarah gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Mark squeezed her hand under the table, his eyes shining with pride. The reporters were scribbling furiously. Finally, Arthur's stern expression softened completely as he turned to Sarah. Now, for a more personal matter. Ms. Vance stepped forward and placed a beautiful, velvet-lined box of polished cherry wood on the table. Arthur opened it. Inside, resting on a bed of black satin, were 2 rings. The first was her grandmother's ring. It had been professionally cleaned and polished, the intricate gold filigree gleaming as if it were brand new. It radiated warmth and history. "This," Arthur said, his voice gentle, his eyes full of sincere gratitude, "is a promise. It represents integrity. It belongs to you." He slid the box towards her. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she looked at the symbol of her family's love, returned to her. Arthur then gestured to the second ring beside it. It was breathtaking. A single, magnificent diamond, cut with flawless precision, sat upon a simple platinum band. It didn't scream for attention. It commanded it with a quiet, brilliant fire. "And this," he continued, "is a thank you. It is a 5-carat D-color VV sewn diamond from my personal collection. Its market value will ensure that you and your husband, whose fierce loyalty I also witnessed, will never again have to choose between your conscience and your security. Your future, which you so selflessly put on the line for a stranger, is now secure." Sarah was openly weeping now, tears of shock, relief, and overwhelming joy. Mark put his arm around her, holding her tight. The flashbulbs of the reporters' cameras went off, capturing the moment for the world to see. The tearful, vindicated hero, her loving husband, the benevolent billionaire, and in the background, the pale, humiliated faces of the bureaucrats who had been so spectacularly and so publicly vanquished. 6 months later, the city looked different to Sarah, brighter, more hopeful. A montage of their new life unfolded. Sarah, no longer in scrubs but in a smart business suit, stood at a podium, cutting a red ribbon. Behind her, a new glass door read, "The Sarah Jenkins Promise Fund, St. Jude's Hospital." The new hospital administrator, a kind woman with warm eyes, applauded enthusiastically beside her. Another scene. A terrified family sat in the same admissions office where Sarah had made her fateful choice. A new, compassionate clerk smiled at them. "Your son's surgery has been approved," she said gently. "Please don't worry about the cost. The Promise Fund has it covered." The family's tears of fear turned into tears of relief. Then, Sarah and Mark in the sun-dappled backyard of a modest but beautiful new house. The oppressive weight of their old apartment was a distant memory. Mark stood at a professional drafting table, a pencil behind his ear, sketching blueprints, his dream of being an architect now, a tangible reality. Sarah was on her knees in a flower bed, her hands in the rich earth, planting roses. Her grandmother's simple gold band was secure on her finger. The magnificent diamond ring was gone, having been sold to build this new life of peace and security. The final image of the montage was of Sarah sitting across from Arthur Pendleton in a simple, bustling diner. He was back in his worn flannel and jeans. They were laughing over coffee, 2 friends, equals, their lives forever intertwined by an act of kindness in the sterile chaos of an ER. Sarah's voice, calm and clear, filled the air as she looked out over her new garden. "My grandmother told me her ring was made of promises. For a long time in the darkest days, I thought I had broken that promise by giving it away. I thought I had failed her. But I was wrong. The promise wasn't about keeping an object safe. It was about keeping what the object stood for safe. Integrity, compassion, the courage to see the humanity in a stranger, even when it's easier to look away. I wasn't tested by a diamond mogul in a hospital bed. I was tested by a system that had forgotten how to care, by people who had traded their empathy for policies and their kindness for promotions. In the end, it turns out that real wealth isn't stored in a vault or worn on a finger. It's measured in the lives you touch and the promises you have the courage to keep, no matter the cost." The camera zoomed in, past the roses, past the green lawn, to a close-up of Sarah's hand, now resting in Mark's. The simple, elegant gold band, the one that had started it all, shone in the warm afternoon sun. The promise was home,